Welcome everyone. This is David Erhan. Today is Christmas Eve. At the time I'm recording this, every Christmas you get attacks on traditional Christianity. One of the attacks that we've seen recently is this idea that Christ was actually supposedly whitewashed, right? That the Christ that we know that he looks like is nothing like what he looks like. In fact, the real Christ looks like, people come up with these strange theories. I'm going to look at the two main theories that we have, but one of the theories is it's a very laughable one. I don't think it even requires a refutation, but I will still make the video here. Is this idea that Christ is actually a black North African man with dreadlocks, right? The image that we see on the right. Another theory is this is based on archaeological, so-called scientific findings, where they have put some archaeological findings, facial structures into an algorithm, and voila, you get the average, an aggregate representation of what a Middle Easterner looked like in the first century. This argument is very weak. The reason why it's weak is that it's actually completely speculative. It's not even really a scientific argument. It's a speculative argument because you're basing your depiction of someone by the aggregation of some random archaeological findings that you see in that region. The problem with this is that even in the same country, even today you can look at a German, for example, from the same country. You'll find two Germans that might look completely different, right? Completely different facial structure, completely different hair color, completely different hair, style, from natural hairstyle, completely different eye color, right? Completely different, facial hair, growing. Like some people might have beards, some people not even grow beards until they're 30 or something like that. 30 is too late, but like until in their 25s or something. Maybe even, skin color, right? A lot of people in Bavaria, for example, there might be a lot of blonde people in Bavaria. There might also be people with more of a swarthy complex in that same area. So these kinds of aggregations don't really help a lot, right? Especially when we're talking about the Middle East of that day, which had a bunch of different populations living in there at that time, makes the argument even weaker. So what arguments can we even really use to know what Christ really looked like? Well, before we get into that, the main criticism and the main reason these arguments come up so much is this conspiracy theory of and I like a good conspiracy theory, but this one's kind of just not good. It's this idea that the Western Christians subverted Christ into becoming this white Jesus, and they did this by making a painting of Cesare Borgia, and they said, oh, this is Jesus Christ, this is what he actually looked like. And the image on the left is supposed to be representative of that. Now, whether that is true or not, to me, I don't really care, and I will show you why it actually doesn't even really matter. But on the image on the right, we can see that Christ is not really depicted as how a traditional European white person will look like. In fact, he looks quite Middle Eastern. The most you can say is maybe he looks a bit Italian or something like that, but that will be a stretch. Now, before we get into a documentative method of how we can understand what Christ actually looked like, let's take a look at the ancestors of the Virgin Mary. Her ancestors, which are commemorated in the Orthodox Church, are Saints Joachim and Anna. Saint Joachim was a Judean, whereas Saint Anna was the daughter of a Levite priest. So the Virgin Mary has a very Hebrew ancestry, so to speak. Therefore, Christ will also, by that logic, likewise have a very Hebrew ancestry and not a North African one. Now let's get into the meat of this video. What documents can we use to prove what Christ looked like? Well, the image on the left is from a 6th century icon of Christ. This is from an Egyptian monastery, I believe. And as you can see here, this depiction, which is a very early depiction of Christ, the earliest existing depiction that is in the form of a panel icon, I suppose that's what people call them, is, you can see, is in fact not that different from the whitewashed depiction 10 centuries later. The only difference really is the hair color, and you can argue that the hair color only seems different because of because maybe you can argue that there's a light, right? Like kind of this like divine light shining in, or the transfigured state or something like that, or some form of transfigured mode of Christ. Whereas on the left here, you can make a kind of an argument at least. The only difference is hair color. Everything else looks quite similar. The facial structure looks similar. Facial hair looks similar. Eye color pretty much looks similar. Skin color looks similar. In the middle, we have a traditional Greek Orthodox icon of Christ. In the right, we have a traditional Russian icon of Christ. You can see they all look the same. This here is a 6th century, I believe, a Coptic icon of Saint Menas and Saint of Christ. This is again from the 6th century. So once again, the Pantocrator Sinai icon, this Coptic icon, they look very similar. But in fact, if you think that the 6th century is not early enough, it's not early enough. 6th century is not good enough for me. 6th century documents, they're not good enough for me. I want earlier. Sure, we have even earlier. The image on the left is a late 4th century depiction of Christ. Those are 300s. And by the way, we're talking about Romans here. Romans knew what Middle Easterners looked like. Okay, so these people are not completely speculating on their own. How should we depict Christ? Should we just make up imagine thinking that all of these people from different, because the image on the left is from Rome. The image on the left here is from Egypt. So are you going to tell me that people were just independently making up stuff and they all happen to look very much alike? Of course not. And the image on the right is from a Roman catacomb. Is again from the year 400. It's from the 400s, early 400s, by the way. Again, of Christ. They all look, once again, very similar to each other, and they just happen to coincide with the Shroud of Turin, which also looks very similar to how Christ looks in icons. So as a matter of fact, we have an actual living evidence too, because these icons in the Orthodox Church are used even to this day. The depiction has, again, not changed. We don't speculate about how he looks. We depict him as he has been in history. Now, some people might argue again, well, you're talking about icons here, but what about the Ethiopian icons? Because there's a lot of Ethiopian icons of Christ, and they depict him as brown. The first thing I will say is that the Ethiopians, ever since the Council of Chalcedon, are schismatic. They're not part of the church, and many of their icons existing today, if not all of them really, are back when when they were schismatic. So that's really not my problem. They're not part of the Orthodox Church. We don't consider them to be part of the Orthodox Church. I'm not this is not an excuse, it's just the truth. Ethiopians are not part of the Orthodox Church if you're not in communion. So you can bring it up to them, not to us. But even Ethiopian icons themselves, I mean, yes, there are sure brown depictions, etc. But even in Ethiopian churches, there are depictions of Christ where he is, relatively speaking, white. On the left, we have an Ethiopian icon of Christ. This is from a Ethiopian Catholic church, I believe. So you might still say, oh, it's from a Catholic church, but it's still from the Ethiopian tradition. The image on the right, as you can see here, is from one of the oldest if not the oldest. I believe it's the Church of Saint Raphael, the angel. This is a depiction of Christ on the image. It's one of the oldest Ethiopian churches in Addis Ababa. And the Christ that looks, this Christ looks closer to the Cesare Borgia Christ than the Black Christ of Talbot Swan. Looks way closer, right? And the point that I'm trying to make here again, once more in this video, is that we have actual living documented proof, stronger documented proof than speculative archaeological evidence or speculative racial idolatrous so-called evidence of many of these people of what Christ actually looked like. We do know what Christ looks like, and we also have Christ as Orthodox Christians. We not only know what he actually looked like, but we also have Christ in our sacraments and in our liturgy, in our worship, because Christ was not merely just a human being, he is also God. And we worship Christ because he is God. And we understand much closer than anyone who Christ is as Orthodox Christians. And that's what I wanted to end this video with. So if you like this video, share this around, click like, comment good stuff, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see all of you in the next video. Thank you for watching, and may God be with you all. Once again, thanks for watching.